Hi everyone, so today we are going to talk about Git and version control systems. So let's do this by analogy and start with something nice and simple. Let's imagine that you are a poet and you write a verse of a poem every day. So on day one, you create a verse for your poem. On day two, you write a second verse. On day three, you write a third verse, but you make a small change to the first verse. And then on day four, you write a fourth verse, but you make a small change to the second verse. Now let's imagine that you want to go back and see how was my poem on day one, how was my poem on day two, how was it on day three, and how was it on day four. Or let's say you want to make a comparison and see exactly what changes do you have between day four and day two. One very naive method that you could use is simply create a copy of the directory on each day. That would be very hard to track by hand, and it would be very wasteful as well of disk space with some data that takes more space than just writing a poem. So that's what a version control system is. It kind of does that for you, and that's also what Git is, because Git is a version control system. So, again, you can actually do this with photographs. If you're a photographer, you can do this with movies. If you're a videographer, Git can track changes between anything. It doesn't have to be a poem, it doesn't have to be source code. It can be absolutely any kind of data. So that's kind of the first element of what Git is. The second one is you need to start thinking about collaboration with other developers. So let's say you're working with some other poems. I said developers, poets, whatever. Let's say you're working with some other poets and they have some different specialities about different kinds of poetry, and you all want to collaborate and write the poem together. So now you need to have a centralized server, and you each need to have a copy of the poem as well. And you need to have a way so that, when you make a change, essentially you can push your change up to that central server. They can pull that change to their local copy. And then when they make a change, they can push it as well. You can pull that copy as well. And also, if you make conflicting changes, you need to have a way of merging these changes and resolving the conflicts as well. So the first element is kind of what's a version control system. The second element is how do you collaborate? And the third element is what do you do as far as the history is concerned? So in the past, we used things like CVS, for example. CVS was a very popular and a very dominant version control system for a very long time, which was then later superseded with things like Git. And with CVS, you had your whole history on the central repository, and then you would simply have a copy of the code, and then you could do this these differences, these comparisons, pushing and pulling, etc. One of the big differences with Git is that number one is decentralized. So everyone has the full copy of the poems in their local copy as well. So if you lose the central repository, it doesn't matter, because someone else can just say, okay, I'll become that central repository, and then you can synchronize all these changes and you're absolutely fine. That was not the case with CVS. And also the fact that you've got your whole history means that if you want to look at the differences between these different days, or if you want to go back in time and have checkouts of exactly how was the poem on that specific day, you can do that without being online. You can do it while you're offline. You can work with complete freedom offline, and then finally when you connect, you can push all your changes back, pull all the changes in, resolve conflicts, etc. So that adds lots of freedom. So that's a very broad overview of what a version control system is and what Git is in particular. And now let's jump right in with some specific Git commands, and you should maybe write them down or put them inside Vulkan or something like that. And we'll also talk about the overall design philosophy of Git. All right, so let's jump right in. I think that Git is taught in a wrong way, because when we start talking about the overall architecture of Git, for example, people will start talking about GitHub, and I think that's the wrong way to do it, because the thing about Git is you can actually have a repository. You can have, let's say, a local folder. You can have a local folder on your machine, and that can be a remote repository. That can be that can be a remote repository. Remote repo. So in the case of our poem, imagine that you have your work environment here. This is your work environment, okay? And for now, we just want to have our poem inside of here. Poem. Then the remote repository is essentially the place where you put the poem. You'll put it there. Or you may pull the changes from there as well. Because, you may have some other poets who want to have their own copy. They want to have their own copy of the poem. And the collaborative process, which I was speaking about earlier, essentially you would share your poem via this remote repo. And now I think, first of all, one of the mistakes that people make when they teach Git is they'll tell you that, they'll just kind of imply that this is a server somewhere on the internet. And that's not actually the case. That can actually just be a local folder as well. That can just be a local folder in your home directory. That can be a local folder, okay? Or it can be github.com or GitLab or whatever. It can be GitHub or GitLab, or there's a whole variety of these services that will allow you to store your remote repository and share your code with collaborators. Okay, so now I'm going to give you a very concrete look at how you would create a remote repo and how you would put like a poem or some code in there or whatever, and then how you would push your code to that remote repo and clone it into a separate directory. Because I want you to see that you don't need necessarily to connect up with GitHub or GitLab or anything like that whatsoever, and that's really key and very fundamental to the design philosophy of Git. So let's take a look at that. I'm going to create a folder called repos. So I'll do mkdir repos. And I'll go inside repos, and you can do the same if you want. And I'll do mkdir poem, cd poem, and I'll do git init bear dot. And this actually creates a bear directory which can be used as a remote. So again, we'll take a look at what we have here. Our remote repo in this case is inside my home directory repos/poem, and it's really that simple. Okay, so now let's take a look. How would we actually take a copy? How would we clone this remote repo into a local directory? So I'll cd back into my home directory, and this time I'll go inside. I'll create a temp directory, cd tmp, and I'll do git clone my home directory /repos/poem. And sorry, I've already got a poem directory in there. And git clone repos poem cd poem. And now if I do an ll, it says total 0, but in reality I've got a .git directory that's got some essentially it's got the working the working directory, the local repository rather. Okay, so this is the local repository that's inside our working directory. Now I'm going to add a couple of lines to our poem. Vim, I'll create poem.txt, and I see trees of green, red roses too, and I'll write that into the file. I'm in Vim, and I'll quit. And I'll do git add dot. And actually, before doing git add, I'll just do git status. And now you'll see that it says on branch master. Let's not worry about branches for now. We'll do that in a future video. No commits yet, so nothing has been committed. And untracked files poem.txt. And it's telling us nothing added to commit, but untracked files present. Use git add to track. So, the first command, like there's a couple of commands for you to remember. And again, you can write them. You can write them in a separate file, or you can use Vulkan. So far, we've learned about git clone with essentially a path. And then you can give the name of the repo. So if you don't give a name, if you say, as we did earlier, home directory /repo /poem, then it will get checked out as poem. Whereas if you would write the path space and then something, it would get cloned as directory something. So that's the first command that we've learned about git. And the second command that we've learned is git status. And the third command that we're going to learn is git add dot. And that adds the poem inside your staging area, and we'll talk about what the staging area is. And now I'll do git status, no commits yet, changes to be committed. So essentially, this is in our staging area. And in fact, we can kind of see that it's in our staging area because it uses the word unstaged. It uses the word unstaged. So, we've staged this, and now we've gone from a working directory to our staging area. So let's talk about that. What is the staging area? Well, once again, we have our remote repository. Okay, we have the remote, and we have our working repository, our working directory rather. And that's what we did by doing a clone. Working directory. I'm going to draw a big box here, and I'll say that we have our working directory. And we have a staging area. And we have a local repository. Now, what is the local repository? The local repository is actually that .git folder. That's the local repository. The staging area is what happens when we do git add. So I'll say from the working directory to the staging area, you would do git add dot, as we did. That would move things from the working directory into the staging area. And then, this arrow is pointing to this whole box. It's not just pointing to the staging area. Okay, I just want to be really clear. But actually, therefore, maybe forget about this, and we'll say that the remote, that's pointing to your local repo, okay? We'll say that it's pointing to your local repo, and we'll say that it's also pointing to your working directory. But I'll explain why later on, and don't get too confused about where these arrows are pointing to for now, okay? And then finally, when we do a commit, a git commit, and we're going to see that happen in a short second. When we do a git commit, we are going from your staging area to your local repo. Git commit. So let's do a git commit now. Git commit -a means commit all the files that are in my staging area, okay? Don't specify files one by one. So for example, I could specify perm.txt. If I had a different file in my staging area that I wanted to commit, I could say git list the files. But I'm not going to do that. Instead, I'm going to commit everything that's in my staging area. And then I'll add a message as well. So I could say -m, but I'll just say git a m, and then a message quotes, and I'll just say added. That's my very, very simple commit message. And there we go. Now it says master root commit, and we've got some kind of hash, added, one file changed, one insertion, create mode perm.txt. Now if I do git status, ignore this message for now, git branch, unset upstream, don't worry about that. Nothing to commit, working tree clean. And now I'll do git push. And git push, what git push will do is that it will push that local repository. It'll push that local repository, the changes to your remote, okay? Git push. Git push. Okay, git push. And let's see that in action, git push, and that's done. So now, what's the point of all of this? Let's do git log. Git log will show us that we've pushed ignore this head master, origin master for now, because you'll get confused, but essentially we can see that there's one commit, we can see the author, and we can see the date, and we can also see the commit message. So let's actually clone this repository into a separate folder to simulate someone else working on this repo. So in temp, I'll do git clone home directory /repos/poem, and this time I'll call it poem2. And again, my bad, I've still got the directory in there. And poem2, cd poem2. And what do we have in there? Surprise, surprise, we have poem.txt. And if I do git log, I get the same as earlier. So now what do we have? Now what we have is we have a second checkout. Okay, we have a second clone of our repo. So we can have a separate arrow. And again, I'll draw a box like this with 3 sections, because I really want you to get this clear in your mind. And here we have the local repo, and that's our .git directory. And then we have our working directory, and we have our staging area, staging area. So in our working directory, we've got this poem.txt, poem.txt, which we also have here. Poem.txt. And if we make changes to poem.txt, and it's important to note that poem.txt is now tracked. Okay, so I'm just adding some of the real core terminology here. Poem.txt is tracked. Because if you added a new file, let's say, you know, foo.txt, if you didn't do git add on this, that would actually be untracked. Untracked. Okay? But since we ran git add, this is actually tracked. And if we make some changes to a tracked file, then once again, we'll need to stage. And, you know, poem.txt is also in our staging area. It's also in our local repository now. So, you know, I would have to write it everywhere, but essentially by doing git add, we'll once again, if we make changes, we'll have to stage the changes. We would have to stage the changes, okay? And then once again, by doing a git commit, and the way that we would stage the changes once again is with git add, and the way that we would then commit those changes is with git commit. And again, the way that we would push these changes is with git push. So let's take a look at once again doing git add, git commit, and git push. Well, first of all, let's make a change to our poem. Vim poem. I see them bloom for me and you. And then I'll do git add, well, git status, and now it's telling us changes not staged for commit. So git add, this time we'll say poem.txt, git status, and now we have a modified file. Git commit -am, and I'll say added a second line to first verse. Git status, and now it says your branch is ahead of origin master by 1 commit. And don't worry what this origin master means, we'll cover this in a future video. And I'll do git push, and that pushes our change to home codebase repos poem. And by the way, you can actually clone this as well by doing git clone home codebase repos poem, and that will clone the poem into your working directory. So now let's go back to the original one, cd poem, and do git pull and this pulls the change. This pulls the change into our local directory and into our local repository as well. And now if I do more poem.text, we get this. I see trees of green, red roses too. I see them bloom for me and you. So now let's look once again at our overall picture. We now have two repos. We have two repos, okay? Two clones of the same repo that's on this remote. And that's really it for now. This is the first Git. This is the first Git lesson. Although I would also add one last point before we go. It's that you don't actually need to go through this process of creating a remote, and you can simply create a repository without needing to connect it up with a remote, okay? And for this, we'll do something like, let's say, mkdir poem3, cd poem3. You can do git init. So we're not using the bare flag. And now this is a Git repository that's not connected to a remote. So let's look at our image once again. This time we'll simply have a third one here. But now this one is completely independent. So we have our working directory. We have our staging area, and we have our local repo. But this time it's not connected. Okay? We don't have a connection between this remote, so this is essentially standalone for now. Standalone. Now, let's say we, for some reason, we're just creating this completely disconnected. And I'll just say vim some verse.txt, and I'll say I see skies of blue and clouds of white. Git status, git add dot git status. So now we've run git add, so we have staged. We've done git add, which actually means that this file is now tracked and it's inside our staging area. And I'll now do git commit -all with a message, added the start of a new verse. Git status on branch master, nothing to commit, git log, added the start of a new verse. And so that's it for now. I want to actually leave things exactly how they are before we go into some more details later on. And I want you to think in terms of like the overall design of Git, which we've presented here, and I want you to think about the various commands that we've learned as well, and make sure that you practice, make sure that you let these commands kind of sink into your mind, as it were, once you start becoming comfortable with that terminology, once it starts feeling a little bit less alien, then we can go ahead and add on to that. But I think that's good enough for today. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'll speak to you in another video. Bye bye.